By the turn of the first millennium AD, the so-called Christian calendar, the complete personification of the Buddha's human form became the norm among famous pilgrimage sites of the followers of the Buddha. This development did not actually just appear out of the blue, because early heroic Aryan figures of prehistoric renown, most of them being Vedic dragon slayers, were frequently described in their activities as human divinities, usually in the guise of priests, Brahmins, or as famous sages, using the term the munis. A muni is a sage, a forest-dwelling renunciant. Included among such figures are the storm god Indra, referred to as a Brahmin, or the Vedic god of fire Agni, and even occasionally the plant of the god Soma Pavamana is personified. The human aspect of an Aryan lotus god is also foreshadowed in the Upanishads by the ideal of identifying a person's own soul with the creator god known as Brahma. And this ideal results, this understanding, this comprehension, results in a person becoming, as they say, a lotus flower among men. And it turns out that the vast majority of iconic, anthropomorphized images of the Buddha since the turn of the Common Era portray the sage as a golden man that stands upon or reclines himself across a lotus flower. These mythic and metaphorical representations were popular in song and in scriptures during the early centuries of India's classical period, an age in which we encounter little in the way of artistic imagery from archaeological records, as we have noted. Nevertheless, the earliest Buddhist records, whether biographical or doctrinal, do in fact describe Siddhartha as a mortal man whose destiny was to attain the stature of a Mahapurusha. This title usually being translated as an exalted or cosmic person, cosmic man, the ideal man. This is to say, then, a human being with divine, godlike qualities. And as we have discussed in episodes on the Vedas, on the Vedanta and Hinduism, the title of Purusha is synonymous with the Vedic concept of Hiranyagarbha, of the god Vishnu or the god Prajapati, all being creator gods, which were often associated with or identified as the plant god Soma Pavamana in Vedic hymns, or as the creator spirit Brahma in the pre-Buddhist doctrine of the Brahmanic Upanishads. In our separate discussions on the Upanishads, we mention a passage in the Isha Upanishad that describes the god known as Prajapati, Lord of creatures, as a fully personified deity with whom Brahmins identified themselves after they drink the elixir of immortality. When they say, "To the yonder person in the sun, whosoever is he, am I also." The Buddha's assumption of the title Purusha is but one of many Pali appellations that anthropomorphize the Buddha as a human figure. So he is both a person of the sun as well as a person that awakens within his sun-like lotus flowers. He is like the Vedic god Hiranyagarbha, the womb of gold, and he beams with the enlightening rays of a lotus flower in his golden womb. And indeed, some of the most famous Soma-drinking singers of the Vedas and Upanishads share a family name with Siddhartha Gautama. Gautama was the family name of some very important composers of the Vedic hymns. To quote the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they say, "Yonder world, Gautama, is fire. The sun itself is its fuel. The rays, its smoke. In this fire the gods offer faith. out of that offering, King Soma arises. So this Vedic patronym, Gautama, refers to a person who accesses King Soma by pouring soma juice into the sun's smokeless fires before an altar, a prehistoric practice that anticipates and complements various early Buddhist beliefs, philosophies, and ritual practices. For the Buddha himself, like the Aryan plant god Soma, was frequently characterized as a kinsman of the supernal sun, using the titles Aditya Bandhu, or as a member of the solar clan, Surya Vamsin. Aditya Bandhu, as a title, refers and relates, of course, to Vedic references to the sons of the riverine goddess Aditi, sons being the Adityas, and include the sun god Surya, Mitra, Aryaman, and other sun-like vegetative scions that rise out of the rivers of the Punjab from their aquatic mother. Every one of these deities is closely associated with a solar pillar of universal law in Vedic hymns, which is typically associated with Soma Pavamana. A sculpture of an 11th century Buddha at Sanchi, which was elaborated more than 1,000 years after this famous site portrayed the Buddha aniconically, i.e., without an image of a man. Here he's illuminated by the warmth and light of a lotus flower from above, in a human form, as though the flower were the sun, which deviates substantially from earlier sculptures at Sanchi that avoided any and all human portrayals of this cosmic man. Identification of the Buddha and his flower as a member of a solar clan merely identifies the sage as the same solar, smokeless fire to which passages of the Upanishads refer before the age of Buddhism. This particular symbolic theme migrated far beyond Buddha's place of origin, and arguably reached a pinnacle of popularity in the Far East, especially in Japan, where the Buddha and his lotus fields are filled with sunlight flowers that beam a spiritual light upon the enlightened sage. Here and elsewhere, he is bathed in rays of golden light from his floral throne, not from the sun. Or if not from below, then from above. Spiritual flames often envelop the sage when he enters into a deep trance known as samadhi. So these artistic conventions draw a direct linkage between the sun, the lotus, the enlightened man, and the spiritual fires known as tapas, or tejas, the same term and the same flames that irradiated Vedic Soma and Agni in prehistoric hymns when they arose from rivers. The Buddha assumed this particular aspect with distinction. But during a post-Vedic period of Indian history, images of an awakened Buddha are more fully personified, as are in fact all members of both Buddhist and Hindu pantheons during the Common Era. A Buddha's golden, solar countenance in Asian mythology is also reflected in the Buddha's title Angirasa in the Pali Canon. This being a Vedic term, a prehistoric term that refers to a class of holy men known as rishis, whose brotherhood comprised 7 divine members, the proverbial 7 sages of Indo-European mythic traditions. They are all celestial sun gods that formerly bestowed eternal life on Vedic priests during Soma pressings. He inherits that title. One of the Angirasas of the Vedas, Atharva by name, is identified as the supposed author of the Atharva Veda on account of his expertise in performing Soma sacrifices. So this is both a mythical god, an Angirasa, as well as a performer of the Soma sacrifice among Aryan tribes. In Vedic hymns, we are never too sure who is a sage, a rishi, a sacrificer, or who is a god. For when Indo-Aryan priests drank soma, they identified their own souls as gods and their own status as godly. So it is not by coincidence that the Vedic god of fire, Agni, is the first, the oldest, chief of the Angarasas. Since Agni was also described at times as a smokeless form of fire that conferred Brahmin priests with immortality during soma sacrifices, the mythic image of this god with flames surrounding him is difficult to distinguish from many iconic images of the Buddha. All of them are Angirasas. This being the case, it is not surprising that iconographic renderings of Agni on the 10th century Parshvanath temple at Khajuraho in central India, with flames erupting from his shoulders, and a lotiformed goad and soma vessel in hand, is hauntingly similar to a much earlier portrayal of the Buddha in Kapisa, Afghanistan, during the 4th century, where the accomplished sage engenders similar smokeless flames from his shoulders as he miraculously floats spontaneously into the air above a lotus grove. This image probably relates specifically to a tale in the Divyavadana, which recounts how the Buddha once miraculously produced a stream of water from his feet and flames from his shoulders to effect the conversion of a king and his counselors to Buddhism at Shravatsi. These early Buddhist sculptures in Pakistan, which art historians attribute to the so-called Gandharan school of art, reveal the continued use of both fire and lotus altars during the turn of the first millennium. And both images clearly portray the metaphorical notion of a quote-unquote smokeless fire emanating from a lotus blossom. It seems hard for me to imagine that Buddhist communities during this age were unaware of the role of fire altars in prehistoric Vedic practices, much less of contemporaneous soma sacrifices that were practiced during this day. The conflation of spiritual fires and lotus motifs migrated from Central Asia into China around the 2nd century and became a standard iconographic convention in religious imagery during this time period. The flourishing of Buddhism in Wei, China, for example, that would be Wei, Wei, as early as the 5th century, gave rise to this typical Far Eastern interpretation of a Buddha in his aura of smokeless flames. The Buddha's corporeal constitution is often referred to in Pali texts as kaya, a term that connotes a Buddha's divine body, kaya. So when the Samyutta Nikaya text asserts, and I quote, "The Buddha may be spoken of as a Dhammakaya or a Brahmakaya," admits that the golden body of a Buddha is a material manifestation of both truth, Dhamma, as well as Brahma, the Hindu creator spirit. Either or both notions can be symbolized by the image of an unwavering lotus pillar of Dharma, pillar of truth, as observed here in a 12th century sculpture from Angkor, Cambodia. In this scene, the Buddha has literally taken the place of Brahma on the lotus throne as a Brahmakaya, body of Brahma, while the four-headed image of Brahma, who sits to the sage's right, assumes a rather subordinate position on the ground, with folded hands, as he pays homage to the god of gods, the Buddha. And on the opposite side of the Buddha, we observe the Vedic storm god Indra, who also pays homage to the enlightened Buddha, now a transcendent being that is literally above the material manifestations of both of these gods. So for the Angkorians in Cambodia, the the image of Brahma and the Buddha were essentially interchangeable, a notion that is expressed repeatedly in older Buddhist texts of the Pali Canon. If we remind ourselves that Vedic and later Hindu doctrines recognize all Hindu gods as material manifestations of Brahma, each reflecting a unique but incomplete component of the grandsire's endless potential forms in the natural world, then the Buddha can also be envisaged as the embodiment, essentially, of all the Vedic gods. While Hindu gods are born, live, and die within a world eon, which Brahmanic mythology recognizes as a lotus cycle, a Padma Kalpa, they actually continue to do the same in Buddhist tradition. But in Buddhism, they come and go within the time frame of what Buddhist scriptures referred to not as a Padma Kalpa, but as a Buddha Kalpa, a cycle of the Buddha's floral awakening. And similarly, we may recall that the word root of dharma, dar, meaning in Sanskrit to support or to bear, we recall that this relates to various Vedic terms that describe the heavenly pillar of the soma plant, the so-called Devo Darunam, the pillar of heaven. In recognizing the lotus plant as soma, we are compelled to recognize a direct correspondence, then, between the lotus pillar of a Buddha and soma's more ancient pillar of the sun. Later usage of the term in Buddhist doctrine can hardly be considered original, since the Dharma of the Buddha is identified as the physical manifestation of all Buddhas. To quote a few very old and original Buddhist expressions, all Tathagatas, all those Buddhas that are thus come, are the Dharmakaya, the body of Dharma. Or, he who sees the Dhamma sees me. He who sees me sees the Dhamma. The Dhamma referring materially and symbolically to an erect lotus stalk. Since the Buddha is all-knowing, all-seeing, and immortal, Amrita, these same conditions also embody the metaphysical concept of Dhamma, which we can trace conceptually to allusions in the Vedic hymns to Somapavamana as a source of Dhamma. They would say Dharma in Sanskrit. Various birth tales of the Buddha's former incarnations speak of his rebirths on earth, specifically as the creator spirit Brahma in past lives. And even during his final reincarnation on earth, the Buddha is referred to repeatedly as Brahma Bhuto, translated literally as become as Brahma, for having achieved enlightenment. Or in similar fashion, a Buddha is also referred to as Dhamma Bhuto, as the truth become, as are all his followers. They're all Dhamma Bhuto, insofar as they are identified as true sons of the Lord Buddha in the Digha Nikaya. For they themselves were, and I quote, born from Dhamma, created by Dhamma, and heir of Dhamma. For the body of Dhamma is the body of Brahma, or to become Dhamma, that is also to become Brahma. This is Buddhist doctrine, that Brahma, as we know from our episodes on Hinduism, is a lotus-born god, a Padma Yoni, lotus-born, and essentially the coessence of lotus flowers in myth and doctrine, Hindu myth and doctrine. It is no wonder that the iconography of Brahma and the Buddha are indistinguishable. Well, almost. The only physical distinctions between pictorial presentations of Brahma and the Buddha are that Brahma exhibits in classical iconography 4 faces, and in contrast, the Buddha has only 2 eyes on a single face, with a 3rd eye fixed between. In myth, a Buddha is often referred to as a Chakravartin in Sanskrit, or a Raja Chakravati in Pali. both inferring that the cosmic man is a turner of the cosmic wheel of Dharma for having achieved enlightenment. He turns Brahma's lotus chakra, lotus disc, manually when he preaches the Dharma. This would be, of course, the same lotus flower on which Brahma enthrones himself. And the trident symbol that is often associated with the world wheel, the Brahma chakra, which signifies or symbolizes the thunderbolt of the Vedic storm god Indra, was reconfigured to symbolize the Buddhist concept of the Triratna, or the triple jewel, as I mentioned earlier, representing the Buddha, his doctrine, the Dharma, and his followers, the Sangha. This is an interesting mythic and iconographic motif, because the triple jewel of Buddhism is commonly referred to as well as the triple refuge of the Buddha's disciples, an allusion that clearly borrows from the 97th hymn of the Rig Veda's 9th chapter of songs, dedicated to Soma Pavamana, which likens Soma to the sun-like dawns of the waters and identifies the plant as a, quote-unquote, threefold refuge for the singing priests. Or by the same token, the Vedic storm god Indra is also said to be a triple refuge for his devotees in the 6th mandala of the Rig Veda. But this 2,200-year-old relief at Sanchi that you see here was executed about a century after the erection of one of the oldest known lotus capitals of India at the same site, which is often referred to as a Persepolitan lotus capital by art historians. Now, Persepolitan refers to Persepolis, an ancient city of Iran that was established by the Achaemenid dynasty around 2,500 years ago, the city being established by a famous king by the name of Darius. Now, Darius was a Zoroastrian king and priest, a Perso-Aryan who was a Homa drinker, not a Soma drinker. And he prospered about 2 centuries before the reign of Ashoka, the man who erected these lotus pillars. But Darius had enjoyed for a while control over the Punjab, northwestern India. Hence, the close contacts between Persian iconographic themes and those of ancient India. In India, this Persepolitan capital symbolizes the Buddha's pillar of truth, and also identifies him as a proverbial Chakravartin, a turner of Brahma's chakra. As you can see here, a symbolic chariot wheel revolves about the flower, a flower that supports 3 roaring lions. That would be the sermons of a Buddha. The Buddha's Brahma chakra traveled far and wide as a lotus flower across the expanses of Asia over the course of the following 2 millennia. In fact, an early 7th century specimen of a lotus chariot wheel appears in Thailand during an age in which Brahmanism dominated religious life in most of Indochina, but often in the company also of migrant Buddhist communities. Here and elsewhere, the solar chariot wheel has a lotus blossom for a hub and a felly that presents a series of smaller flowers in the round. There are countless variations on the symbolic theme of a rotating lotus wheel. In Japan, for example, a red-petaled lotus mandala is quite similar to the aforementioned Thai world wheel. But the movement of this mandala is implied by placing a svastika above the so-called world womb mandala. Prince Siddhartha is born to earth with the same qualities of Vedic Soma, Agni, Indra, and other anthropomorphized solar scions of the past. To quote the Mahayanist Milinda Panya, he was golden in color with a skin like gold, and a glorious halo of a fathom's length spread around him. Similar wording in the Vedas describes the solar qualities of Soma, Indra, Surya, Mitra, and Savitar, all of whom, as sun gods, assume a vestment of golden rays when they break out of their white and red robes to illuminate the heavens with a golden light. In various passages, they are also personified and take on mythic roles as golden, immortal seers, or rishis. In our episode on the Vedas and Soma, we recall that the god of fire, Agni, who is sometimes identified specifically, explicitly, as Soma, the plant of the gods, experienced his daily awakenments to a golden light at the dawn of each day. So, Agni is described as being Ushar Bud, meaning awakened to the dawn. And sometimes Vedic Agni is fully personified and becomes a prototypical omniscient Brahman that, the Vedic hymns say, awakens his devotees to Vedic knowledge during Soma sacrifices. And in a similar vein, the Buddha himself, like Agni, is golden and surrounded by spiritual fires when he achieves enlightenment during Soma sacrifices. Centuries later, if not thousands of years later, Siddhartha Gautama assumes this same divine role. And like Vedic Soma, Agni, Mitra, and other sun gods, the so-called kinsmen of the sun, would inherit the same mysterious solar eye of the world from his divine Aryan predecessors, the term being chakum loke, eye of the world. And this eye sees all and knows all, just as it did in Vedic mythology. In fact, the Buddha's third eye illuminates the 4 quarters of space on the day of his birth, as well as the day of his predestined rendezvous with enlightenment. With this divine eye, the Buddha is said to see, or maybe I should say to envision, his inner peace. He literally sees the truth, the Dhamma, with this mysterious eye. Buddha's chakum loke is also homologous in mythology and iconography to the third eye of his lotus-seated counterpart Shiva, as seen here from Vietnam, in that the inner eye of wisdom of this contemporaneous Hindu divinity rests in the middle of his brow, from which it burns away delusions of duality, multiplicity, or conditionality in the material world. Note how Shiva's third eye is distinguished from the other 2 eyes by its vertical orientation, and that the sun and moon above the eye are indicative of its cosmic proportions, i.e., as comprising the combined energies of fire, sun, and the moon. These concepts are entirely Vedic in origin and apply specifically to the light of Soma Pavamana. It is said that the enlightening rays of a Buddha's light are emitted from a circle of hair that surrounds a third eye that is also located between his brows. And this light has the same impact, the same result as the eyes of Shiva in destroying the delusions of the material world. Nor can the Buddha's prominent omniscient eye on a 6th century Chinese statue be distinguished from the third eye located on the brow of Vishnu, since Vishnu concentrates upon his divine eye when he enters into his ecstatic states of yogic bliss, also samadhi. To quote the Bhagavad Gita, making the breath to enter altogether between the eyebrows, he goes to that supreme divine spirit. So once again, Hinduism and Buddhism develop in parallel. The final entry of a Buddha into bliss establishes a path and goal for the sage's followers, so that they might follow the path to immortality, to Amrita, a Sanskrit term that is also referent to the celebrated plant saps of the Soma plant in Vedic tradition, which confer immortality. The Golden Buddha is specifically identified as either a portal or a gateway to the state of deathlessness. And this allusion must surely derive from Vedic passages that allude to Soma as a metaphorical golden door to immortality, and or to a nectiferous lunar vessel of the moon. Buddhist tradition implies this theme by placing vases full of the nectar of the gods, the Vedic Kailasha, in close proximity to enlightened Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. All Buddhas are described as golden cosmic beings that are born from golden flames that pour out of a golden floral womb as awakening scions of the sun. These are peculiar human attributes that are symbolically associated with the Buddha's dharmic pillar of truth, an erect lotus shaft. Oftentimes, the Buddha holds a vessel of his so-called nectar of truth in his lap, while also presenting a hand gesture, known as a mudra, that connotes samadhi, blissful trance, when he places his palms together in his lap. This particular iconic form of the Buddha is essentially indistinguishable from those of Soma and Brahma in Hindu iconography during the same age, which we demonstrate in our videos on Hinduism. Or in biographical imagery, the placement of a cup of Soma in the lap of the Buddha at the moment that he touches the earth is meant to mark his ultimate achievement of Mahasambodhi, enlightenment. The details of which we will discuss in our separate video on the life of Siddhartha Gautama. Portrayals of this type seem to discount early commentaries of Sanskritists, such as Oldenburg, a German Indologist, who assumed that the Soma sacrifice played no significant role in Buddhist tradition. Buddhist myths and doctrines are, in fact, I'm telling you, replete with references to the use of the elixir of immortality and its continuing role in the attainment of enlightenment. And we find this theme very much present in artistic records as well, as you can see here. More often than not, the Soma vessels of a Buddha are decorated with lotus petals, much as they are in Hindu iconography, which presumably implies that the nectar of the vessel was extracted from lotus flowers. On the 17th century Japanese world womb silk mandala, a Soma Kailasha is sustained by a lotus and topped with another flower that emits a trident, the preferred weapon of Vedic Indra, that was used to appropriate Soma, the nectar of the gods, from riverine serpents. To quote the Rig Veda, the beloved thunderbolt girt with brightness, Indra reveals the Soma juice, pressed out by tani stones. Note also the head of Rahu above the urn, whose mouth spills forth drops of Soma. We cover this mythic theme in our episode on Hindu mythology. Mythical and biographical accounts of the Buddha likewise equate Siddhartha with Amrita, that would be an elixir of immortality that heals human suffering and their mortal state. And while assertions of such type are largely interpreted by modern Buddhologists as no more than metaphorical remarks, the role of the Soma beverage in Buddhist tradition can hardly be denied when we consider the fact that the sage, Siddhartha, himself is unable to attain nirvana without partaking of a bowl of the elixir of immortality. The so-called nectar of the Buddha's law, along with the physical manifestations of a Buddha's dharma in its floral form, are often identified explicitly as the means, the direct means by which mortals pass into a higher realm of existence. To quote a rhetorical question in the Milinda Panya of the Pali Canon, does the Tathagata, the Buddha, present the gift of his ambrosia to the men and gods in the 10,000 world systems? And are not those beings who are capable of doing so made wise by the nectar of his law, the nectar of his dharma? Would this be a metaphorical expression, or might this be an historical observation? This question underpins most of what we have been discussing in our exploration of Buddhism on Paradise Earth. And it will be the topic that we'll cover in our biographical sketch of Siddhartha. The complex relief work in stone at Sanchi provides a treasure trove of historical insights into the mythic perspectives of nascent Buddhist communities before the turn of the 1st century AD. The eastern portal to Sanchi's largest stupa, one of 4 outrageously decorated gateways that are positioned at the cardinal points of a burial mound that conserves the bodily relics of Siddhartha himself, or so legend has it, reveals an inordinate appreciation for the Brahmanic pantheon and traditional Aryan symbolism. Classic Vedic animal symbols dominate the lintels, while various personified deities, especially a plant goddess, appear sporadically in this gateway. We observe 2 separate images in this particular perspective of a lotus goddess, this being Vishnu's consort Sri Lakshmi, who are bathed with celestial waters by elephants. While a very sensuous fertility goddess, the classic Indian Yakshi, dangles her voluptuous body from a drooping mango branch on the entrances to the stupa. These are all representations of prototypical Indo-Aryan goddesses that can be traced to the Vedic era. Yet there is not a single image of a Buddha in his human form among Sanchi's religious imagery, even if this is the burial grounds for a Buddha. As we have discussed, this was intentional because a transcendental God, such as the Buddha, lacks the qualities and conditions of any living god or mortal creature. A Buddha is above and beyond all this busyness. By the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, we begin to encounter full-bodied human effigies of Siddhartha Gautama among the ruins of ancient Gandharan, a well-known Buddhist region that covers a large part of the Punjab and points to the north and west. The Buddha's human aspect in this school of art exhibits many physical features and a brand of apparel that more closely reflects European taste and sensibility than those of Asians. Historians attribute this observation to the arrival of Alexander the Great's armies just prior to the appearance of these statues, many officials of which came to appreciate the exotic philosophical views and practices of ancient India once they settled into their new homeland. We also encounter iconic images of Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist divinities during the same time period among the ruins of Mathura in central India, these reflecting a school of art that arose among the upper reaches of the Ganges River. The growing popularity of Buddha and Brahmanic icons does not mark, however, an end to the use of traditional Buddhist symbols, because these anthropomorphized impressions of the sage are typically covered with symbols that formerly stood alone on low reliefs and sculptures of earlier stupa or temple sites of the Buddhists. So the traditional trident, the Dharma chakra, the Purna garbhas and lotus flowers are transferred from lotus pillars into the hands, onto the feet, and onto the heart of the proverbial world conqueror, also known as a Jina, world conqueror, transcendent. Just as the earlier Upanishads make repeated references to discovering the lotus of the heart when a sage achieves Brahman, we frequently encounter lotus flower symbols, such as swastikas and vajras, positioned above the head or upon the heart of Buddhas, of bodhisattvas, and jinas. This new approach to artistic expression, i.e. iconic expression, using the human form, provided Buddhist artisans an opportunity to explore and portray Siddhartha's fantastical life with renewed interest and vigor. Just what exactly inspired this shift in iconographic practices and symbolism remains a mystery, but a large number of historians have noted that the innovation owes in part to the influences of Western cultures, of Mediterranean cultures, that arrived and conventionally depict their most powerful of gods and goddesses as human divinities. So, the abrupt appearance of Mediterranean peoples in the Punjab is recognized as an historical milestone in the history of India. And it does seem more than coincidental that the process of more fully humanizing transcendental gods of antiquity during this age coincides chronologically with the appearance of anthropomorphic Mediterranean gods as well in the Punjab, many of which we observe in Gandharan sculptures wearing Greek togas. These iconic Buddhas are also associated with European mermaids, Dionysian ecstatics, and Mediterranean acanthus leaves on Corinthian lotus capitals. The final passage of a Buddha from earth into oblivion upon the experience of nirvana is referred to as parinirvana upon Buddha's death. This state signifying no possible return as a spirit to the wheel of life. This is the only stage of the Buddha's life that portrays the sage in a prone position. But even in this posture, the Buddha still finds his earthly grounding upon a lotus flower or within a lotus grove. His identity is therefore attached organically and inextricably to this sacred plant, from cradle to grave. And this observation should prompt us to ask then, is the sacred lotus a symbol of the Buddha, or might a Buddha be just another form of personifying the divine plant, which we have identified with Soma Pavamana? Since we have demonstrated with the foregoing that the Buddha assimilated essentially all of the classic symbolic features that were formerly attached to the Vedic plant god Soma, I am thinking the evidence weighs in favor of the latter possibility, because the famous sage of the Shakya tribe was portrayed both iconically and aniconically as a sun, a solar chariot wheel, a pillared tree of life, as a spiritual fire, a divine eye, and roaring lions, all of which symbolic forms pertained originally to Vedic Soma, just as they've always shared close symbolic associations with the sacred lotus. The marvelous decorations on Sanchi's 4 arched portals were constructed 2,200 years ago to separate the burial grounds of the Buddha's body parts from the outside world. And these constructions mark a starting point for the development of India's substantial contributions to the history of art. We can be sure, however, that these images did not just spring to life from out of the blue, out of a void, because the Toranas, the fencing and balustrades that surround the stupas at Sanchi and Bharut, were constructed with mortise and tenons, as though they were slabs of wood. So no wonder archaeologists have suggested that earlier structures with similar architecture and decorations were likely built with wood materials before the inhabitants of the Gangetic Plains turned to the medium of stone to construct their temples. We lack physical proof of this assumption, however, because very few wood articles of this age have survived the monsoonal rains of tropical India over the course of 2,000 years. Moreover, the highly refined imagery is so amazingly complex and detailed that it seems certain to me that iconographic and mythic traditions of early Buddhist communities had been developing and evolving long before the construction of the stone burial grounds at Sanchi, Barut, and early cave sites. This being the case, we must acknowledge an unbroken linkage between Buddhist and Vedic symbolism and mythology. If this is true, then we would expect the mythic themes relating to the life of Siddhartha Gautama would also reflect mythic images of the Vedic pantheon and of Vedic traditionalists. If so, then we might hypothesize that the Buddha's close relationship with the sacred lotus derives from the plant's former associations with Somapavamana in the Vedas. Judging from past experience, I am thinking that a number of established scholars on the subject are going to have their doubts. And for those doubters, or indeed for those who see my point, I recommend you consider our video on the biography of the latest Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, for further details, floral details, of the Buddha's mythic life on Paradise Earth.